Do you ever find that when you're reviewing your answers to AAA questions, particularly the long written questions, that you're never quite sure how many marks they're worth? And it's hard to know whether you're on the right tracks. Well, if that describes you, this recording is really going to help. We're going to take 3 different types of questions that typically come up in the AAA exam, and I'm going to show you how to mark them. My name's Ben Wilson, I'm an expert ACCA tutor, and I'm going to guide you through this session. So those 3 different types of AAA questions. We're going to start with audit risk questions, then audit procedures, and finally ethics questions. These 3 types of questions come up on virtually every AAA exam. So audit risks first of all, and the mark scheme will say something like up to 3 marks per well-explained risk. But what is it that makes a risk well explained? Well, it's a tough question to answer that because it really depends on the risk. But the type of things that you're looking to do in an answer to get all 3 of those marks are to use the scenario. Start with facts from the scenario. Talk about whether it's an inherent risk, a problem with the company's business in some way, the underlying trade that exposes it to risk, a control risk, a problem with the company's systems that stopped or that hasn't prevented or detected the error from happening, or is it a detection risk, the auditor has missed it somehow. Talk specifically about which account or accounts are affected and whether they could be under or overstated. You've got to get that in the right direction. If it's that there could be a problem either way, you should say misstated. Include calculations around materiality, relevant materiality calculations. That doesn't mean crunch every single number, but if it is relevant to talk about the size of the balance, you'll get some credit for looking at a materiality calc. And finally, make sure that you apply your knowledge of accounting standards. Now, that doesn't mean brain dumping everything that you know about that particular accounting standard. It means quoting the relevant part of the standard and using the facts from the scenario to decide whether perhaps there has been an error in the way something has been accounted for. Right, let's see these points in practice with an actual exam answer. We're here in the ACCA's practice platform, and we're using the March-June 2019 questions. Now, you can access these yourself from the ACCA's practice platform. And if you want to have a go at these questions first so that you really understand them, then it would be a really good idea to pause the recording here and have a go at question 1, the long case study question from this paper. Now, what we're going to do, first of all here, is look at part A, which is this risks of material misstatement question. And we're going to I've prepared an answer here with a few points in it, a typical student answer that we're going to mark together. Now, here's the marking guide showing on screen. If you'd like to have a detailed read of it first, then please pause the recording here. And over here, you can see the answer that I've prepared. What I'd like you to do is have a go at marking this for yourself, awarding up to 3 marks for each of these risks, and we'll compare notes shortly. Okay, let's have a go through this together. The first of these points, advertising expense with some relevant materiality calculations. Now the marking scheme says award materiality calculations a mark, so we'll give those a mark because they're relevant. How about the rest of the description though? Advertising expense should be expensed rather than capitalised as an intangible asset. So the asset is overstated and profit before tax is overstated. So that's correct in that the asset is overstated, and they're right, you shouldn't be capitalising advertising expense. But it doesn't set out the correct accounting treatment in any great detail. And so I would want a little bit more. If we look at the model answer for this part, you can see that the examiner is including much more information from the scenario around this, why they potentially have made the mistake, and talking about the justification that was given in the scenario. And Well, you don't need to quote the particular accounting standard number. That's not required. But it does show good understanding here, using the correct terminology and language. It's just a little bit neater, a little bit more description has been given. And also worth noting that instead of just saying asset is overstated, the model answer is talking about it's more specific about the type of asset that's overstated, and it's operating expenses that are being understated, rather than just talking about profit before tax generally. And so, although there are some decent points in here, it's certainly not worth anywhere near the full 3 marks. I'm going to give that 1.5. What about the second point here? The discount being offered on online sales. So this is in the marking scheme, and it is a decent point. I'm not sure, though, that the online sales amount is particularly relevant here to the discount. It's a bit confused to try and bring two things together. Better to separate those out. It's kind of saying they've offered a discount, but operating margin and return on capital have remained constant. And look, that is noted in the marking scheme here. It's setting out what they would have expected to happen. We'd see sales going up but margins decreasing. So it looks like sales are overstated, or that's not quite right, the operating margin overstated. That's kind of saying that the costs are understated. So it's a little bit clumsy there. So reasonable, bit clumsy towards the end. I'm going to give that 2 marks out of the 3. What about the third point here? The amount spending to ProPack company has been capitalised in intangible assets, and it talks about the amount that's being capitalised. The standard shows that research costs should be expensed and development costs being capitalised only when some standards are satisfied. So the intangible asset is overstated and the profit before tax is overstated. Okay, now this materiality calculation here, because they've talked about the amount that's being capitalised in comparison to total assets. Reasonable materiality calculation. I'm going to give that a bit of credit, although it's only doing it in relation to assets rather than in relation to profits as well. So perhaps I'm only going to give that half a mark. And then, yes, you're right. You should only capitalise when certain criteria are met, but it doesn't say what those criteria are, the relevant ones, and it doesn't use the information in the scenario to assess whether those criteria have been met. This point is a bit too general. And it's correct that it's intangible assets overstated, but too vague on the profit before tax. They should be talking about whichever expense it is that's understated as a result. And so, again, I'm only going to give this 1.5 marks out of the 3. What about that final point? There was a loan taken out during the year. However, gearing fell. Loans may be misstated. This is too vague. It needs more explanation. So gearing fell, and what you would have expected to happen when taking out a loan is that gearing would rise. But you need to explain that because there's more debt in the capital structure. It needs further detail, further explanation. It's inconsistent, and yes, so they're onto a point here, but they've not explained it fully enough to get real credit. Loans may be misstated. No. If gearing has fallen, it suggests that the loan has been understated rather than misstated. Loans are too low, because if they were correctly recorded, you wouldn't have seen the gearing falling. So that should be understated rather than misstated, so we're not going to award credit there. So out of the 3 potential marks here, yes, they've picked out something reasonable and they've highlighted inconsistency, but not explained it fully enough. I'm somewhere between half a mark and a mark here, going to be a bit generous and give a full mark, although that could easily have been just half a mark. Okay, how did your mark compare with mine? I gave this 7.5 marks in total. How did that compare to your mark? Can be quite subjective marking AAA. Now, the markers of the actual exam follow very strict criteria, and there are lots of controls in place to make sure that they're consistent and your script gets the mark that absolutely it deserves. However, for you, when you're marking your own script, it can be quite hard for you to judge whether your point has been well explained enough for it to get 1, 2, or the full 3 marks. But hopefully looking at this, you've seen some of the things that each of these points did that meant it didn't get the full 3 marks for any of them. Audit procedures now. And typically the marking scheme will say 1 mark per well-explained procedure. But what can you do to make your audit procedures well explained? Well, my biggest tip is to always state what you are doing with the audit procedure and why you are doing it, how that's going to help. Be really precise about the verb that you use. So use verbs like inquire or observe. Don't say general things like test or check. You might have been able to get away with those in the audit and assurance paper, but at this advanced level, the examiner is expecting more from you, and they expect you to be precise in the way you describe your audit tests. Always good to have a source of evidence, what you're going to agree something back to, perhaps title deeds or some other source of evidence. And really good if you can link this audit procedure to a specific financial statement assertion. That's the why part. So we're going to observe something happening or inspect the title deeds to confirm ownership of an asset. Let's look at an audit procedures question now. We're back here in the March-June 19 exam paper that's up on the ACCA's practice platform. And we're looking at part B from the long case study question, question 1. And we're asked to design the principal audit procedures to be used in the audit of 2 areas, a factory impairment and some development costs that have been capitalised in respect of new packaging. And it's 10 marks, so 5 marks for each. Now, if you'd like to get the most value possible out of this, I would recommend that you pause this recording and go and have a go at this question yourself. It's readily available on the ACCA's website before you go through and mark this answer with me. So here's the marking scheme for this particular requirement showing on screen. And here's an example student answer. What I'd like you to do is to use this marking scheme. And there's the full scheme showing there. What I'd like you to do is to use this marking scheme and award up to 1 mark for each well-described procedure that is shown in this answer here. So pause the recording here, have a go at marking this, and then we'll go through it together. This first point, obtain the management impairment review. So obtain their review, so that's the source document. Great, I like that, off to a good start. And what specifically we're going to do, we're going to have a look at these assumptions and make sure that they're reasonable. So this is a good test. It's got a source document and it's saying what we're going to do in the audit test. And yeah, I like that. There's nothing about a particular assertion. This could have been even better if it had talked about a financial statement assertion, which would be the accuracy of the calculation. But I like it anyway. This is going to get a full mark. Second one, recalculate the impairment loss by the auditor using the correct value in use assumption. Now, if you look at the marking scheme over here, it's getting at this point here, isn't it? Basically, redo this calculation with a lot of procedures around this correct value in use assumption. That's all of these procedures down here. And if you look at how the answer is set out, it's a lot more specific in using information out of the scenario, isn't it? This is a bit vague, a bit high level. This could be written about any requirement, any question. So I don't think there's enough detail in here. There's not enough use of information out of the scenario for this to be worth a full mark. And so I'm just going to give that a half. On to the next one. Physically check the broken condition of the factory and also check the existence of the machinery. Okay, so inspect it for existence and to see if this could be better. Assess its condition and see if it needs any further impairment. So you could have had a bit more detail to get it, make it even better, but I do like that point. I'm going to give that a mark because it's specific about the verb and it talks about a financial statement assertion. What about the second part of the question then? This first point here, confirming with these directors of ProPack about the current condition and the time of completion. Well, this is third-party evidence because Propack is outside of our own company, and it's a specific verb. So it's a decent test. And they're saying why they're doing it to confirm the condition of the packaging. It would be even better if it talked about things like technical feasibility, because that's relevant to whether it's been whether it should be capitalized. So it could be improved, but it's still decent. So I'm going to give it a mark. What about the second point? Looking at this contract. It's getting at this point in the answer, isn't it? But it doesn't quite do it. It doesn't explain what. It does the what very well. What we're going to do is have a look at this contract. But why do we want to know the exact term of the packaging? Well, this answer doesn't develop fully enough. If you look at the model answer here, it's about whether the asset will be controlled and owned by us, and therefore whether we can capitalise it. So as it stands, I think this is only worth half a mark because the why is not developed fully enough. On to the next one. Reviewing board minutes to know there is an authorization for the investment. Well, reviewing board minutes is a decent test to suggest if you're running out of ideas, but you have to make it relevant. It has to be, what are we looking for here? Well, knowing whether this investment's been authorized or not doesn't really matter. The money has been spent. So even if it was unauthorized, it wouldn't make any difference as to whether we can capitalize it or not. It would show a control weakness, but that's not really that relevant here. So nice try to get an extra mark by suggesting a board minute review, but they'd have to find something more relevant that is being discussed, something judgmental, perhaps about the condition of the packaging or time or funding to complete the project, something like that, but not around authorising the expenditure that's already happened. So I'm not giving that any marks. And this last point here, obtain representation from Propack, whether they have enough cash to develop the packaging. Now that's not quite right. Propack are the company that are developing it for us, and it's us that's going to be paying the bill. It's Margot that's going to be paying the bill. So the emphasis of this is slightly wrong. Here's what the point in the answer they're trying to get at. Do we have enough money to pay for this? Not the company that's doing the development for us, because we would be paying them so that they have the funds to complete the project. And so this wouldn't be a relevant test. Almost, but not quite. So that's not worth anything. So in total, 4 marks for me here, 4 out of 10. How did that compare to your answer? I do feel like that's a little bit harsh. I've marked this fairly, but there are a couple of places where they almost scored marks, but they weren't quite clear enough in their wording, and they weren't quite precise enough. For example, talking about the wrong company down here to pick up the marks. On to our third type of question that comes up regularly in the AAA exam, ethics. Now, the marking schemes for the ethics requirement will generally be 1 mark per well-explained point, but sometimes it's 2 marks per well-explained point. You don't know whether it's going to be 1 or 2. And so I would assume that it's 1 mark per point and try to come up with enough points. So if it's for 10 marks, you need 10 well-explained points. However, if you're really struggling to come up with more than 4 or 5, then perhaps it is going to be 2 marks per point, and therefore you might need a bit more detail. You don't know in advance and therefore assume just 1 mark per point. So what makes your points well explained? Firstly, make sure they answer the precise question that's been asked. Next, use appropriate ethical language wherever possible. Use terms like confidentiality, self-interest, self-review, conflict of interest, objectivity, the kind of things that the marker is going to be looking for. Get off the fence. State the correct course of action. So, yes, it's worth discussing perhaps the morality versus the commerciality of the ethical issue, but come down normally on the sort of more moral side, doing the right thing, but set out what the company should do or any correct legal position. And make sure that you develop your points fully. Ask the question, so what? What does this mean? Don't leave any stone unturned. Let's now have a look at an actual exam answer so that we can put some of this marking into practice. Here we are back in the March-June 19 exam for AAA from the ACCA's practice platform. We're doing part D of the first case study question. Discuss the audit implications of this email from Len Larch, recommending any further actions to be taken by our firm. And here's that email. We're told about some sharp practice around using chemicals that are banned and a little bit of bribery thrown in for good measure as well. Now here's the marking scheme for this particular requirement. And here is an example answer for you to have a go at marking. Pause the recording here and have a go at marking this for yourself using the marking scheme. Right, let's compare notes. First point. Companies instructed farmers to use some chemicals which are prohibited. It's good start. It's illegal, great. So we have broken the law, and there may be negative press that would harm the company. I really like this point, but it's not answering the question. The question is, get back to there being the audit implications of this. So the audit implication of these breaches of laws and regulations, the audit implication of that is that there could be unrecorded liabilities for the fines. It could be that there's the regulator might get involved and might well withdraw their license to trade. And that could impact going concern. So this hasn't done quite enough. So I'm going to only give this half a mark because it hasn't really answered the question, although it has made decent points. Second point, the auditor should notify the management team to stop using these illegal chemicals. Yeah, so discuss with management, make sure that they're aware of this issue. Not a bad point. I want a bit more explanation though. We're kind of getting at there that they might not be aware of it. So we're effectively being the whistleblower here, aren't we? But they're not necessarily aware of it at the minute. So I wanted a bit more detail on that, so I'm only going to give it half a mark. Oh, lovely. Management integrity issues because the directors were offered a bribe. Yes, that's a really good point. But the problem, why is that an issue for the audit, going on to fully answer the question, is that we can place less reliance on management representations. So we'll have to get alternative audit evidence. That's the audit implication. And there could quite easily be override of controls if we don't trust senior management. They could be overriding controls if they're behaving in an unethical manner, and that means control risk could be higher. We might have to do more substantive testing during our audit. So again, this isn't fully explained enough. I'm only going to give that half a mark. Oh, actually, when it comes on to the second one, next point here, obtaining alternative evidence where possible, not rely on management representations. So that is a decent point developed on from this. So I'm going to give that one a mark. Fruit trees might have been damaged by the spraying, reducing the yield in later years and causing sales to fall. That's a problem for the business, not necessarily a problem for the audit. If we're thinking that sales might be overstated or that there could be going concern issues, that's how this becomes a problem for the audit. But as this stands, it's not answering the question, therefore it's worth nothing. Oh, human health could be impacted. We should report to the relevant authorities immediately. That's getting at this point over here around the auditors potentially having a legal duty to disclose because this is in the public interest, danger to human health. But they're not really used the correct language here. Nothing about there being a legal duty. And because this is in the public interest, that's the test, isn't it? As to whether we should breach confidentiality. So to make this better, it should have talked about breaching confidentiality. It should have talked about it being in the public interest. So yeah, it's a decent point, but it's a little bit clumsy. So I'm only going to give it half a mark. So this answer is going to score 3 marks in total out of 10. Harsh, but that's just how it is. The standards are pretty high when it comes to AAA. That concludes this recording. I hope you found it useful and it's given you some insight into how AAA is marked that will help you when reviewing your own answers.